This is a production of Cornell University.
Hi, all right, I'm setting my timer for 30 minutes so that I'm sure that I have enough time for us to chat afterwards, and we'll see how quickly I flow through. So when I sat back to think about what we would talk about today, I realized that the past 5 years have been sort of a stream of consciousness. We keep trying new things and spreading out and branching. And my goal for the day is to take you on this journey with us that we've gone on. And at any point, if you have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat so that you don't forget it. And then maybe we can talk about it at the end. But if you need clarification, if I'm going too fast, if I'm using an acronym that isn't familiar to everybody, then by all means, feel free to shout out and stop me as I'm going. So I'm going to share my screen. This is essentially going to be storytelling time for all intensive purposes. I'm going to throw a whole lot of pictures at you and just describe what we've learned as we've went along. I haven't been involved with a lot of the horticultural production until really, I would say, this past year. That's more my colleague Kelly Hennigan, but we work as a team. And so I'll let you know a bit about what we've done and where we've come. So let's begin. All right, let's see if my computer is going to cooperate with us. There we go. When I first went to write this presentation, I set up the slides for each of the years, and I realized about 15 minutes into it that I was off by 20 years, that I had written 1996, 1997, 98, 99, and 2000. So apparently I'm stuck in the 1990s, but then I fixed it and realized, no, we started growing in 2016, not 1996. So that was our inaugural hemp crop, and we were partners with JD Farm, and at their farm, we grew 30 acres. So our goal was really, we thought that grain was going to be the low-hanging fruit. So we were going to focus on grain production. We said we don't really know so much about grain production when it comes to an organic farm, and JD Farm is an organic farm. So our research focus was looking at, can we meet the nutrient requirements for this crop using different combinations of manures, and we figured we would just compare yield between them as our first go and see how we did. It was the craziest year for importing seed. It was the first time around. We had no idea what we were doing. Getting the seed took way longer than we thought it was going to. The shipping company, when they figured out what they were shipping, so we ordered our seed from Canada, and it almost made it to us. It made it to Syracuse, and then the shipping company realized what they were shipping and wouldn't take it a foot further. And so I had to drive to Syracuse with police escort to pick up the seed, sign for it, and drive it back. And then we had to have police watch the seed so that none of it was stolen between the time when we or received it until the time it got in the ground. And so that was crazy. So we didn't get planted until July 4th. So year one was what we thought was a late start. We didn't get planted until July 4th. And we had hired a local grain farmer to custom harvest for us. We had no idea what we were doing. It was a really steep learning curve. They had no idea what they were doing. So we figured, let's all learn together. Being the first crop, everybody wanted to get in on pictures. So even though we planted with let me get my laser pointer. We planted with a grain drill, as you can see here. This is Dan Dolgen and Mark Just from JD Farm. And we were all planted a few, this is me and my kids, we all planted a few seeds by hand. This was the truck we had to go pick up the seed on and be police escorted back. So it was quite an exciting time. And even though our research question was all about nutrients, we learned a little bit about pest pressure. And that first year, we learned a whole lot about weeds. And that although we were hearing lots of people in the surrounding communities talk about the fact that they were concerned that cannabis sativa would become the next major field crop weed, what we were learning was that this plant cannot outcompete our weed species. We had heard horror stories from Kentucky about how devastating Japanese beetles could be. And so we were really nervous when we started to see some Japanese beetles on our plants, but what we realized was that they were mostly hanging out on the male flowers, and a little bit the weed species in the field were acting as trap crops because they were preferring being on the pigweed around the hemp than they were on the hemp. So that was sort of interesting. We started learning a little bit about seed production, and we saw that what it meant for this crop to be indeterminate, and the fact that we have our seeds maturing unevenly throughout the plant. This first year, we had so many people want to come visit the fields and take pictures. I think everybody, we had horticulture classes, we had ag classes, we had administrators, everyone wanted to come and take a selfie in the hemp fields. Right, and so here we can see the unevenness of grain production. We're up the top here. You can see that seeds are brown and drying out, and at the bottom, right, they're still green. And the thought the first year was, oh, well, if we're going to treat this like other grain crops, when we harvest our other grain crops, we wait for the seed to dry out. So we were waiting for our seed to dry before we came through and harvested. And another piece of this picture, you can see the lamb's quarter here along the side, and next to it, that is easily as tall as the hemp plants that were in this field. So in year one, we learned a lot about crop variability. On the left-hand side is a picture of me standing up looking down at the crop. So that's probably about up to my knee. On the right-hand side is me stretching my arm up to reach the crop. And so maybe that, I don't know, I'm 5'3.5" on a good day. So maybe that's almost 5'10", right? Not quite a 6-foot crop there. But we saw a whole lot of variability in terms of height, in terms of the size of the seed head, and in terms of the thickness of our stalks. So what we learned in this first year had a lot to do with what we didn't know. And that's to be expected, right? It's the first time we had ever grown this crop. It was really exciting to learn how many things we didn't know, because from a research perspective, that just makes you say, hey, what can we ask questions about? And we figure that means that we're going to be busy for the next couple of years, right? It gives us something to work on, right? So here, this was a field that was divided into quadrants. There was half that had pig bedded pack, half that had beef bedded pack manure, and then one side had poultry litter added it too. So we were looking at combinations of manures there. But really, we couldn't compare the data in these quadrants, the yield, because the weed pressure was so great that any differences that we saw were mostly because of the differences in types of weeds that we saw on the field there. But it was a learning experience and fun to harvest that way anyway. Okay, come on, any second now. There we go. So year two. In year two, we said, okay, we're focusing on grain, or maybe we can figure out a dual purpose for using the fiber here. We wanted to dial in our nitrogen rates. And so we were starting a small plot study on campus. And when I say small, it was like 1/4 of an acre, a really small plot study on campus to do in collaboration with what we were doing with JD Farm. We were sort of separating our grows. The state had now allowed farms to have their own permits. But then in late May, early June, the governor pushed to have even more acres in production. And so we threw 40 acres in on campus. That wasn't our original intention. And so this was our opportunity to try out a couple of different varieties and really just get it growing, because trying to get seed that late in the game, we ended up not planting until somewhere around July 20th, right? If you remember, the first year we planted July 4th. July 20th was when we got those extra acres in the ground. And so it was a little bit crazy. And we hired that same local grain farmer to custom harvest for us, other than the small quarter acre of plots, which I like to say my darling slave labor, otherwise known as my students, you get a good grade for putting in some blood, sweat, and tears. And so they were in charge of doing all of the hand harvesting of my plots and separating out the grain from those plots. I love them dearly for all their hard work. So things that we learned: hemp doesn't like poorly drained or excessively wet soil. That was the banner description of year number 2. If you have poorly drained soil, you have poorly established hemp. We tried over and over and over to establish in June of that year our small quarter acre trials. We had to plant it 3 times because of how wet it was. This is a field where you can see where it dries out on this line. The entire field was planted, but all of the field in the wet area did not emerge. So, and you can see here, there's a sort of a lake in the middle of this field. June 2018 was really wet, right? So hemp does not like poorly drained or excessively wet soil. And these are the quarter acre trial plots. You can see the flags are, this would have been the plot that we just had to keep trying and keep trying and keep trying to establish, because there was so much water. That was sad. And you got to see my kids in the first year. This is my son the second year. I like to show them, and you can see the progression of how they've grown along with the crops growing, right? So this is the field where we were supposed to be going through and counting emergence, and instead we were just trying to decide when we were going to try and replant again because it was so wet. So July 7th was the 3rd time that we planted there. And then again, 2 weeks later was when we planted the rest of our fields on campus, which we decided it wasn't worth doing a nitrogen rate trial because it was too late. We didn't even think we were going to get a crop. So some of the things that we learned this year, the second year, was we learned a bit about fusarium. We learned a bit about white mold. We saw that there are definitely pests in our area that are going to impact the crop. We saw that if hemp emerges after a weed species, that it can't outcompete. But if the hemp emerges before a weed species and is able to establish, then it does a whole lot better at managing weed competition. We saw lots more variability. So these 2 pictures are the same field where this student is about my height and the crop is up to her shoulders, whereas, I don't know, 100 yards away in that same field, the crop is, this student is a little bit taller than me, but is up to her waist. So we're seeing just so much variability here. And then this is the field next to this one. And even though this picture is taken a month later, you're not getting much more growth after flower establishment. And so the fact that this student is 6'1", so the fact that we have this tremendous growth here, right? It shows us how much variability there is within the crop. It shows us how much breeding work there is to be done to pick out the traits that are going to help us get whether or not we want a shorter crop for grain production or a taller crop for fiber production, right? That we need to see what are the ways that genetics can influence crop production versus what are the environmental influences of crop production. So many questions to ask, right? Every semester or every year, every growing season, we would just find out so many more questions that we would set out to answer one thing and then find 15 more questions that were like, oh, well, before we can answer this, we need to know these things. We did a little bit of work on of indoor grows, looking at microgreens. It was sort of interesting. You know, there is this push for extracts production, but at the same time, we thought, well, what are some other horticultural ways of growing this crop? And can a hemp microgreen compete in the microgreens market? One of the things that we found was that while its taste and palatability were really great, we couldn't compete with California, right? There's a reason that the majority of microgreens are grown in large-scale horticultural production and not in small boutique farms. It's just too expensive. So we realized, you know, growing for extracts is not the only horticultural hemp crop. Growing for microgreens was really successful. Their JD Farms had a line of microgreens in Whole Foods in the city for a while. I believe they've stopped doing that now, mostly because it's just too hard to keep up with the cost of it. Okay, that brings us to year 3, 2018. In 2018, we grew a little bit and started taking on partner farms around the state and expanding our nitrogen trials. So we really were focusing mainly on grain production with a little bit of fiber in there, but mainly grain production and just nitrogen rates for answering the questions of nutrient management. We really weren't trying to answer the questions for phosphorus and potassium quite yet. We're just focusing on nitrogen. There was a whole lot of drought in June that year, and then it got really cold, and August through October were super wet. So the combination of those things made the growing season a little bit difficult. We hired that same local grain farmer to come harvest for us, but that was the last time that we did that because we realized that we were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You hear a lot of people talk about horror stories about harvesting hemp for grain. I think the problem is more trying to use something outfitted for soybeans for hemp or something outfitted for wheat for hemp. If we took something outfitted for soybeans and tried to harvest corn, we'd destroy the machine. It would be awful, right? Nothing good would come of that. And it's the same thing, that the issue isn't the crop. The issue is that we don't have the equipment specified to the crop that we're trying to harvest. Now, over the years, we've gotten better at that. And what we found was that this farmer that was harvesting for us wasn't willing to sort of learn from the things that we were learning. And if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got. And so he was getting angrier and angrier at the hemp harvest, and we were getting angrier and angrier that what we were learning wasn't being implemented. And so putting those two things together, we said it is time for us to get our own combine, because we need to show folks that this isn't as horrible as it sounds. One of the biggest problems with the hemp industry, I'll say in New York State, but it probably applies elsewhere, is lack of good information, and more than lack of good information, prevalence of bad information. So you have all these people telling stories about terrible things that happened and scaring folks off who say, well, I have enough problems. I don't need that on my plate. Instead of saying, oh, no, look, we're learning how to do this better. And since we're learning how to do this better, look, now's the time to get involved. So we needed to counteract the storyline of hemp is nothing but a problem child. right? But in 2018, that was our last year of working with that other farmer. So, these are some of the nitrogen rates that we set up. We were looking to see how does nitrogen impact growth and what is the best nitrogen rate for this crop. One of the things that we found was with poor nutrient availability, and this, I guess, makes perfect sense, our crop isn't able to combat weeds. And so in our 0 nitrogen rates and in our 50-pound nitrogen rates, although not so much in this field because there was leaching from the strips around it, but certainly over here, we saw horrible weed pressure that we just didn't see in the rest of the field. And so the balance of ensuring proper fertility will make sure that our crop can then outcompete the weed species that are there. We started dabbling in NDVI imaging, and it was really interesting for us. Our goal was to see if NDVI imaging could be used for determining if nitrogen applications are necessary. And so here, after looking at that previous map, you can see our low rates, right? Our lower rates here and our low rates here, and then our high rates in between, right? The more green, the more foliage there is, the more red, the more brown or soil is being reflected back, excuse me. So here, this is it at the end of July. Now here we're looking at October 5th. NDVI is normalized difference vegetative index. And what it means is you're taking an infrared image and that the amount of infrared light that's reflected back. So this is essentially a scale that shows you how much is being reflected back. If there's a lot of light being reflected back, it means it's not being absorbed. So that means that there's no plant material there. And so that those redder areas are the lots is being reflected back. The green areas is lots more absorption, and the yellow is the scale in between the green and the red. So what was really interesting for us is the difference between the July image and the October image, right? You could still see those strips a little bit, but you've sort of lost it. And the reason you've lost it is because as the seeds mature, they're brown. And so they're going to be reflecting that light back. So then we started thinking, oh, well, maybe this imaging isn't just useful for nutrient management. Maybe this imaging might be useful for harvest readiness. This was a thought we had there, right? Again, every time we try and set out to answer a question, we get 6 more new ones. And the other thing that was really interesting was in this field, the left side of the field was one variety and the right side of the field was the other variety. So I actually wrote it backwards. This is the Felina 32 side, and this is the Anka side. And so at the end of June, there was very little that was established. By the end of July, we really see a strong difference between these two varieties. And then in the October image, again, we can't see it anymore as we're ready for the harvest readiness. This field didn't get harvested. There was so much moisture in the later part of the summer and early part of the fall that coordinating with our person to come harvest, we were sort of the end of the importance list. I'm being very diplomatic about this, and therefore our crop didn't get harvested on time. And at the end of September, there was, let's see if that's gonna let me. I think I need to get back to my pointer. to be able, there we go. So at the end of September, there was this horrible windstorm and the crop was more than ready to be harvested. So all of that shaking and all of that wind essentially put all of our seed on the ground. So when the farmer came to harvest this field, and instead of getting between probably 700 and 800 pounds of grain per acre in this field, he was getting 80 pounds of grain per acre. He just gave up and said, it's not worth your time. It's not worth my time. I'm not going to do it. So that field didn't end up getting harvested. And so we weren't able to compare the yield results between those two varieties, which would have been really lovely. But what we did see was the importance of harvesting on time. And we learned that the harvest window for hemp is really narrow. Once that seed starts to dry out, it really falls off really quickly. And so harvest readiness is an incredibly important characteristic to pay attention to when we're dealing with grain. When we're dealing with fiber as well, I guess when we're dealing with extract as well, right? Knowing that window is really important. Okay, so we harvested the fiber with a sickle bar mower, and as you can see here, we were on the slope a little bit, and there was wind, and the fiber was falling into the standing crop there. So my job was to follow the sickle bar and take armfuls of the fiber and toss it so that we can come through and get the next big swath cut. That was more exercise than I think I've ever gotten in my life. And at the very end of it, when there was just one armful left, there was a surprise waiting for us in the field. There was a skunk who had just walked out of its little hole and, you know, surprise, saw us, turned around, lifted its tail. And so I had just been throwing these huge piles of hemp so that we can come through and cut. And if nothing else, that was a study on the benefit of adrenaline, because I sprinted across that field faster than I've ever run in my life. And the skunk got the sickle bar, but nothing else. And the skunk's tail is in that field. And I've been told that that tail was then collected and preserved, but I still haven't seen it. So this was our first year of actually harvesting for fiber though. And we were learning a little bit about it. One of the things that we did after that was add this little triangle to the end of the sickle bar to make sure that the fiber tips in the right direction and doesn't fall on the crop before it, right? So all of this had to be picked up and thrown so that we can continue to go through the field. And then we let it ret in the field and raked it with a rotary rake, and then came through and round baled it. And we were looking for dumbness. So totally different focus than with our grain here. We want to see the bast fibers starting to pull away from the herd, and we want an evenness in color. We don't want too much of this dark black here with this light here, right? We want it to be much more even there, but this was our first year and our first go round at it, our first trial of retting in the field. So in 2019, we were set to do that better, and decided that we were really going to split our acres of half grain and half fiber. And then we've also been hearing a lot about, can we do a dual purpose with extracts? Right? Do we have to do our extracts production in a horticultural style, or can we do it in a field crop style, which is sort of how they do it more commonly in Europe? We tried a study of that, and our horticulture department did our first outdoor grow for our high CBD varieties. So we're again focusing on those nitrogen rate trials, focusing on organic versus inorganic amendments. Oops, that was 2018's drought for 20. So what happened in 2019 weather-wise? I think 2019 was an okay growing season. I don't remember right now. Ooh, how can that be 20 minutes already? All right. Now I know I have 10 minutes left. And so that year we found ourselves a 1973-ish international combine, and it took us a little while to get it on hand. So we harvested a little bit later than we wanted to. So we ended up doing a bit of harvesting by hand just to be able to compare our nitrogen rate trials. But it was really exciting for us to have a combine of our own and be able to show that this was going to be a successful crop. And so we did a little bit different this year. We had fewer nitrogen rates that we did in strips in one field. And then in the field across from it, all 4 quadrants received manure in the winter and early spring. And then A and B were top dressed at our medium rate as our inorganic field across the way from it was, to see if that combination of organic and inorganic amendments was better than just the organic amendments. And so we also had A and D were one variety and B and C were another variety, because we're seeing really large differences between varieties. And so that this is the way that map was set up there. So I'm going to show you a couple of NDVI images now of that. Oh, wait, not yet. We also we do reduced tillage, not really no-till. We run an airway through some of our fields, and so there's lots of cover on the ground. And what we were finding was that if there's far too much cover on the ground, you get really poor emergence. But with just a moderate amount of cover on the ground, our emergence was no different than if our field was bare. So that was sort of fun for us to learn. And we also saw this is a field after that was conventionally tilled, and then there was so it was conventionally tilled and they planted, and that same night they had a huge rainstorm. So after that huge rainstorm, you get this surface crusting, and you'll see the only places where the hemp actually came up are in cracks within that surface. So we really saw the importance of planting time, particularly in a conventionally tilled soil where you can get these surface crusts. So we were just learning left and right. Everything we did was we were learning more. So here, this is an image of September 3rd. And we're comparing, this image is just your regular RGB, your regular picture that you could take with your phone, as opposed to a picture that you can take with the infrared camera. And to the naked eye, you can see the difference between what was top dressed and what wasn't, which is sort of interesting. But it's really not as easy to see the difference between the varieties as you can see here, right? Here, this showed us that this field was too small for our strips because there was leaching in between our different nitrogen rates, except for this back area here, right? That area with the low nitrogen rate, you can really see the difference with the naked eye. Do you need an infrared camera for that? No, right? But you can see a little bit more detail with that infrared camera. We also did a study partnering with a private company to test their product to see if their metabolism booster could take a European CBD variety, which means that in Europe, if a crop produces 3% CBD, it's considered a CBD variety. So we took a European CBD variety and sprayed it with their, I think it's another one of them getting my students a year ago getting the sprayer ready. So we sprayed it with this metabolism booster to see how that would do. We had some issues that year with, well, this special variety that we bought took an extra month to get here. So we planted late, and because we planted late, the weeds came back after killing what was in that field with Roundup. It was a mess. So we didn't get the research results that we wanted to from that field, so we redid it this year in the greenhouse, right? We got to harvest with our own combine. We did some modifications to this combine. So this was a really great learning experience for us to see what has to be modified and what doesn't. We only had one small fire, and that was easily doused, so that was lovely. And this is a student walking behind the combine, just checking to make sure that everything is flowing out of it smoothly. And our fiber harvest, this is the video that folks growing for extracts hate to see, because as that fiber falls, right, you can see the clouds of pollen coming out of it. The appropriate time to harvest for fiber is before the females have been pollinated, right? We don't want the male plants to die yet, because the male plants will die after they release their pollen. Otherwise, you lose half of your fiber crop if you let the male plants die. And the female plants, once they're pollinated, the fiber quality changes. So this is the right time to harvest, which means there was a lot of wind that day. There was a lot of pollen moving, but as you can see, this is not a flat landscape. How far that pollen will travel, I believe that Cornell's doing a really good job of answering that question, but truly not as far as folks worry, I think. But you can see that's a whole lot of pollen coming out of that crop. But also the crop was falling straight the way that it needed to, because we have that little triangle on the end of, oops, that's not what I want, sorry. Yeah, there we go. So again, we ret in the field. We did much better in the second year of retting, getting a much more even ret, and we baled that fiber. And in our first year, we had a little trouble with the round baler. In our second year, we learned that we needed to just do a little bit of protecting here of the wires that go from the tractor to the baler. And once those are protected, everything else went smoothly. And so this was a really good example of where you have these terrible stories of doing thousands of dollars of damage to equipment, but then you were like, oh, well, this wasn't hard to fix. And then now it's not a problem anymore. So in 2020, we didn't grow for grain because it's 2020. Who knew what was going to happen? And so I didn't want to set up grain trials. I knew I had 2 student interns, but I wasn't exactly positive if I was going to be able to have them for the whole summer. And so we went through the easy route, and we decided that fiber was the easy way to go. We were focusing, instead of on different nitrogen rates, we were focusing on, could we see a difference in using a leguminous cover crop? And so we looked at cowpeas and we looked at alfalfa, or sorry, not cover crop, intercrop. We also partnered with Beacon Skiff, and they were doing a large CBD grow this year and let us come in and take soil samples and take plant samples throughout the growing season to see if we can track accumulation of heavy metals. There's been a lot of talk of hemp as a heavy metal producer or hyperaccumulator. There we go. Those are the words I'm looking for. And so that was our opportunity to get into that space and see if that's true, for 2 reasons. One, because if you're producing an extract, right, would that extract with heavy metals in it then become problematic? And 2, to prove whether or not it really does hyperaccumulate heavy metals and can it be used for phytoremediation. Man, there was a lot of drought this June. So even though we planted on time, maybe a week late, our crop didn't emerge until July because there was just no rain. And so we went through and hand harvested our plots that we wanted to, but really we just sickle barred and let the crop lay in the field because there just wasn't enough. It was too dry a year. So pictures, you can see how big my kid's gotten. Isn't he cute? This is at the Beacon Skiff field. Their CBD grow looked really beautiful. They did a great job. And this is our fiber field on the day it was being harvested. And this is probably the best part of the field where my laser pointer is. It's about between 5 and 6 foot tall, but this right here is only 3 foot tall. So it was quite a mess. We also did a repeat of the metabolism booster study, but we did it in the greenhouse. And so here you can see a major pest problem that we saw, and what we're waiting to get our data back about extracts, because we noted that there were plants that were infested, and there were a couple of hundred plants right on top of each other, and they weren't all infested. And so we wanted to see if whether the amount of cannabinoids being produced has something to do with whether or not the plants were covered. And so this is going to be another one of our questions of does extract concentration has something to do with resistance to pest pressure? Who knows? And then this was just today in lab. We had students doing an olive oil extraction process just to see that there are quite a few different ways of extracting cannabinoids and terpenes from our plants, and we'll then go through a distillation process. So what have we learned? We've learned about weed management. We've learned that we need breeding. So thank you, Cornell, for all the work you're doing in breeding, because man, are there a lot of traits that we're not sure what's being controlled by genetics, what's being controlled by environmental factors, and how do those two come together. We know that getting nutrient management correct is vital, not just for yield, but also for competitiveness. But it's really hard because so far each growing season we've had a but because the weather has really interfered. Pest pressure has really been all over the place. But I think what's most important to me, and the biggest take-home message for me, is that there is so much variability here. And if you're growing for extracts, you also have a fiber crop. And if you're growing for a fiber crop, maybe there's also extract potential. And if you're growing for grain, what are you going to do with that leftover fiber? And so we need to know what is your focus for your crop, and then where's your crop going to go? And before a seed or a clone goes in the ground, we need to know where that's going to go to, because our supply chain needs work, right? And there are a lot of shysters in the extract world, and so you got to be careful with who you're dealing with. And there's no such thing as a waste product. That if we can develop this supply chain better, there is so much potential for usable portions of this crop. But there's still a lot of bad information out there, and the community at large needs to understand that this is a crop just like any other crop. So my funding sources have been sort of all across the board throughout the past 5 years, and with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
I'll start with the question, Jen. And first of all, thank you for a fascinating seminar, and so glad that you were able to outrun that skunk.
It was really one of my favorite stories so far.
Yes, amazing how fast we can run when necessary. So my question for you is, anytime you're growing a cannabis crop, there are security issues. And on a college campus, how does one alert the public that what you are growing is a crop that does not have THC potential?
Well, I started with signs, and then I went to all of the professors who taught first year experience courses, so that all of the freshmen would hear this is hemp for grain and fiber, not anything that's going to get you high talk. And then I went to the student senate and talked to them. And I mean, it really is a lot of word of mouth. And because there are a lot of ag students on campus, they were able to do some of the smacking upside the head for me. But there were definitely students who went into the field our first 2 years and grabbed samples and tried to sell them. That was always fun. But I can do as much education as I can, and then they just have to learn on their own that they're being dumb.
Great.
It was all about using my resources on campus, though.
Yeah, sounds like you were very thorough. I would love to see if Larry Smart has a question, given the work that he's doing on cannabis.
Hey, Larry.
Hi, Jen. Thanks very much for giving that excellent seminar. Yeah, I'm curious about your modification on the sickle bar mower. We've made some modifications to our sickle bar mower, but we don't have a baler, so we haven't done that large scale fiber production that you have. So can you describe that a little bit more?
Yeah, Larry, it is so simple. It's literally a wooden triangle that is, so if this is the sickle bar, the triangle, and my tractor is over here, the triangle comes out a little bit, and so it's angled. So instead of being like this, it's angled like that. So as the sickle bar pushes through the crop, it's pulling the crop back towards the tractor to fall instead of falling back into the crop. It was just the simplest addition there, and it did an amazing job. That second year, our crop was also a little bit smaller, and so we don't know if that was part of the reason that it fell so nicely also. But it seemed, and this year, I don't know, I want to talk about our field this year. They were so sad. And so I want to see next year if it works as well again. But it was a really simple change.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions for Jen?
Yeah, and I know this isn't exactly up the alley of most of the horticulture program where you're focused more on the indoor grows, but I really think there is a lot of overlap and a lot of collaboration between the different styles of production.
Don, maybe just one more quick question. Jen, you said you grew some new crosses this year. Can you describe those a little bit more?
Sure. So last year they grew berry blossom and Felina 32, and they crossed them so that we had a berry blossom Felina 32 cross. So instead of being tree style, it was much more erect and upright. And so I actually just sent those out for cannabinoid analysis yesterday, and we're curious if that stays upward of 7 or 8%, if that becomes a way of being able to grow field crop production style instead of horticultural production style, because that could be cut with a combine and separated out, as opposed to some of the more labor intensive hand ways, or the ways that we're doing it under plastic now. So
but you got that from Kaylin and Dan?
No, we did it ourselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, we did it ourselves last year. Yeah, so that we had a student last year whose family donated about 100 seeds to us of a bunch of different varieties, and so that's where we got the high CBD varieties from to start with. And then we did, our hort department has been teaching a lot about propagation and breeding, and so they did that cross and then grew it out in the field this year to see how it would do structure wise.
Great. Thank you.
That should be fun.
Any final questions for Jen before we finish up? Thomas.
Yeah, nice talk. So your final point there with the growers need to know who's buying what they're growing before they even plant it. So that's sort of a common problem when field crop growers get into any horticultural crop, and this one's more challenging. And I'm curious what the sense was among the growers that you are working with, how did they have some sense of who was going to be buying it? Did they figure it would work itself out in the meantime, or were there already buyers that they just show up like you do to a grain elevator?
So I had a couple of growers that were planning on processing themselves that had ideas about producing their own hemp oil, and so harvesting the grain to press for oil. That was the most common. Oh, I don't need to worry about a buyer because I'm going to do this. But it is such a different way of thinking that you don't ever worry about being able to sell corn or soybeans or oats or wheat. Right? Like that's not a problem.
You may not make money at it, but you can always sell it.
Exactly. And I think that this is a two-sided problem, right? One is that there is the field crop producers who aren't used to that. And two is the other side of hemp production, there are a whole lot of people who have never grown a thing in their life, who all of a sudden were like, I'm going to be a farmer because hemp is legal, right? So it's not that our fruit and veg farmers are all jumping on board, because you're right, that is part of that production model where you have to know where it's going. This was more different.
Yeah. No, so that
both sides. It's really
so you
hard.
did get both, at least both of those audience. Yes, the new farm, not experienced enough farmer, and the way too experienced farmer.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid
Nice.
we've run out
Thanks.
of time, but Jen, this has been just delightful and informative, and we are so pleased and appreciative that you were willing to share today.
Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate you having me.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.